a little bit more about how the slave trade actually worked and to what extent gender was important in it, or what's called internal fertilization?
Yeah, well, the slave trade really, what was going on, where we had a situation in which Virginia had, about mid-17th century, struck on tobacco as an export. They had had lots of trouble figuring out how to keep the colony alive. They struck on tobacco. And then shortly after that, the Carolina colony was founded in 1670. And they, of course, were trying to figure out a way to fund themselves in order to eventually begin a plantation society. And at this point, the Atlantic trade in African slaves was not reaching up the Atlantic coast. It was all happening in the Caribbean. And the Virginians could not afford to put indentured servants in the tobacco field. It cost too much money, needed too many of them, and they were too expensive. And so they hit on the idea of arming the Westo Indians, sending them down into Spanish Florida to slave the Indians there in the mission system. They then sent those Indians south to the Caribbean, where they could exchange them at a rate of about 4 Indian slaves for 1 African slave. And the reason that they were interested in, the reason that the Caribbean folks were interested in doing this was because of the sort of the deadly nature of the sugar plantations. A sugar slave's life expectancy was about 1 to 2 years max. And so for the Caribbean planters, they could get cheaper slaves and get a little more out of them. And for the Carolinians and the Virginians, they could bring African slaves up into their plantation colonies, and where they were, Indians could run away, essentially. And so the Africans couldn't do that. And so they were attempting to create a market for African slaves on the South Atlantic coast, and they succeeded in doing so. And one of the things that ended up sort of interrupting the native slave trade was the fact that the Atlantic trade in Africans expanded. And the slave trade was creating such a disruption in native cultures that Europeans eventually found it better to let that part of the slave trade go than to pursue it. As far as it goes, captives were part of the Aboriginal system, and those captives tended to be women, and they tended to be children, and men who were captured tended to be tortured to death, brought back to villages and tortured to death, sort of as a cathartic experience for all of the people in those villages who had lost members of their community to the captives' communities. And so the slave trade altered the dynamics a little bit. So it really actually reduced the torture, because these men then became primarily the folks who were being traded to Europeans as slaves, and then the women and children continued to be adopted into these natives, the societies of their captives. So it really amped up the amount of captive taking too. So it just, as very similar to the African slave trade, natives were the ones capturing other natives. They were selling to Europeans, and it created a tremendous political, social, economic upheaval. So, what else? Did I answer your question fully? Any other
Yeah,
any follow-ups or?
Well, I had one little confusion that I didn't quite get there. So what you said here at the end, I thought I heard, were they trading the women and children to the Europeans, or were they keeping them in their own society?
A little of both. They were certainly selling whoever they could sell, but the European demand was generally for adult males. So, a little of both. Again, this is a very little known aspect of early American history. Did you ever end up?
Yeah, you mentioned the anthropology of piracy course, which is of course fascinating.
Yeah.
Including the tie you were wearing yesterday. Stuff there. Noticed that. Could you say a little bit more about it? Because we talked about it in one-on-one, but I was curious to what extent you could tie like our old ideas of piracy and the buccaneers and which we talked about was partly state-sponsored, right?
Yes.
And the kind of current piracy going on, say, Indonesia, Philippines, Somalia,
Yeah,
Nigeria.
absolutely. The course, just a little brief background before I answer that question specifically. My course is really, like I say, I think it's one of the most anthropological of courses that I teach, because we cover piracy from lots of different angles. We look at piracy in popular culture from the 17th through the 21st centuries. We look at the myth and reality of pirates. We look at the social conditions that created pirates out of Jack Tar, the common sailor. And you know, we look at lots of different aspects of history, historical pirates. We look at the archaeology of piracy. We've been bringing up some ships. Blackbeard's flagship off the coast of North Carolina is one example. But then we also think about modern pirates, both in the Straits of Malacca in the 90s particularly, and the Somali pirates recently. And so what we're seeing is we have a certain set of dynamics that have to be in place for piracy to exist. And piracy has always been a subsystem of maritime trade. Anytime there's maritime trade, there is the possibility and likelihood of piracy. And it has to do a lot with, is there a ready market for stolen goods? Is there sufficiently lax security for the pirates to operate? You know, lots of other factors go into it. Is there political stability or instability in the countries that they're operating out of? And so, for instance, with colonial America, every single port that we know of on the East Coast was at one time a pirate port that allowed pirates entrance to their port because they had hard currency that they were going to drop in taverns on gambling, drinking, prostitution. That hard currency then recirculates in the community, and this was a much better way to get resources than to ask these mother countries who were essentially leaving the colonies on their own. As those colonies stabilized and as their economic endeavors stabilized, then they began to crack down on piracy. So, and we're going to see the same thing off the Horn of Africa. So it's all very, very similar as far as, you know, motivations, as far as possibilities for operating, and also the things that are going to reduce that piracy to little or nil. We can, you know, it doesn't matter if we're talking about the 1700s or if we're talking about the 2010s. So it's very, very connected.
Yes. I just saw the myth of chiefdoms, and I wondered if you could address that aspect, because you also mentioned about Cahokia being a chiefdom, and so I'm interested in how those two things connect.
Well, I think that that book title was maybe not a great one. Chiefdoms and Other Archaeological Delusions by Tim Poggetat. He's got a great big mind, and essentially what he's saying is that we have to move beyond our models of chiefdoms, that they worked for a while because they helped us begin to identify and understand this political system that existed in the late prehistoric period. But then he's cautioning about allowing our models to become reality, or about seeing one thing and then deciding that everything else that exists in our models had to have been there too. And so he's looking for a much more nuanced, much more historically based and historically accurate kind of macro history of Eastern North America. And so I think a little bit of an unfortunate title. It turns some people off, but I think is one of the best books of archaeology and archaeological theory that's been written in the last 15 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I just have a question. I don't know if this is completely bizarro, but this is what I'm thinking. So, I was educated in the American educational system. We do not learn a lot about Native American history, right? So I see a lot of value in this. We have these, I mean, it looked pretty large. You showed us that car with the Sageville Mound, and, you know, I've heard of other, mostly Central American, South American with their sites, right? So
Mhm.
Machu Picchu and
Yeah.
the Mayans and all of that stuff. How are we gonna get this, which is our heritage and our culture, and to our education system? You know, I feel like that's important. How do we do that? Especially in the climate that we're in, where we can't even talk about evolution,
Right.
you know, that, because that's offensive to creationists. How are we gonna get, do you see what I'm saying?
I do. Well, I hope that my book is going to be the first, no. I think that part of it is really disseminating this information to the undergrad. I mean, we have to start somewhere, and I think that is the place to start. And generally, things that happen in higher education can then eventually, you know, begin to trickle down. So educationally, I think the way to do it is for this to enter into the undergraduate's mind. But the other thing is public outreach. I mean, we have to start taking kids, if we can, on field trips to those things and try to introduce some experiential sort of learning and bring this into the minds of younger people. And I think public outreach is the way to do that.
What is this site like? Like, is there a parking lot? Is there a
Yeah, it's
Starbucks?
magnificent.
I don't know.
It is, it's magnificent. If you're ever near St. Louis, it is absolutely worth it to cross the river to East St. Louis, Illinois. Don't stay there. It's kind of a rough spot. But this is just despite the fact that there's a freeway running right through this quarter-mile plaza, this is a magnificent site. It's captivating. There are over 60 mounds at this site that are still extant. And originally there were over 100. And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they have a museum there that is one of the most stunning museums that I have seen that deals with Mississippian peoples. Just a fantastic experience. So I highly recommend it. Lots of good artifacts, lots of reconstruction. There's actually a room that you walk into, and it's all set up with mirrors. So they have a few homes rebuilt, and they have, you know, some mannequins and things like, all done very well. It sounds a little cheesy, but it's done very well. And so when you walk in, the mirrors make you feel like you're in a very large village with tightly compacted houses. And, you know, so there are lots of really cool experiences that actually can be translated, whether you're 6 years old or whether you're 60 years old. And so, you know, things like this are certainly ways that hopefully we can generate that kind of public interest and public knowledge. But it is a fantastic site. Some of these are much less spectacular, but Moundville is another one that's very fascinating. They have a new museum there that is spectacular, and this is it's very rural. So you don't have when you stand at Cahokia, you know, you can see cranes and stuff operating on the other side of the river in St. Louis, and, you know, you can see the industrial, you know, wasteland of East St. Louis. But here, all you see are woods around you and the Black Warrior River, which is down about a 60, 70-foot bluff, and it's just gorgeous. So each one of these sites has their own sort of appeal, but I may have wandered off your topic. But I like to talk about these things.
Eric, as a follow-up, we talked a little bit about, kind of included there, resistance to your findings, especially from some Native American groups, because this is not a popular topic for them, right? We talked a little bit about their view of their history. So has there been a lot of resistance, and what would be the way to deal with that or start a discussion on that?
There's been talking now